I'm considering not trimming my beard for the duration of the quarantine just to see how long it gets. I already hate it. The Resident Evil series played an important part in my formation as a person who likes video games. The PlayStation 2 port of Code Veronica, subtitled X, was the first M-rated game I ever played at the young age of 11-ish. While I was a Nintendo guy at the time, my occasional after-school sitter's teenage proper son had a PlayStation 2, and after showing off his very cool Magic card collection, let me stab some zombies. We eventually moved on to Grand Theft Auto 3, but the experience stuck with me. And a few years later, I opened an issue of Nintendo Power to read all about the upcoming Resident Evil 4, which would soon become the first M-rated game I ever owned. For a long time, these were reasons that I felt young. On YouTube in 2020, I think they make me ancient. As has been more than well established, RE4 marked a shift in the franchise as well as game design in general, popularizing the over-the-shoulder camera that would become de rigueur for third-person shooters after Gears of War made some action-appropriate tweaks. But my experience with the game, at least the first time around, was rather scarier than it was intended to be. You see, at the normal difficulty, RE4 is more spooky action than survival horror. You've got more control, more guns, and most importantly, enough ammunition to supply them. But at some point in the game's second half, you go into a laboratory and fight these spike-covered monsters. They can only be killed if you hit their handful of invisible weak spots. I didn't know this, nor did I know that I was supposed to have grabbed a thermal sight for my sniper rifle that would have allowed me to see said weak spots. So, confused and terrified, I put more than 700 rounds, nearly everything I had, into the first one of these monsters before I guess I accidentally hit all of the weak points. I went from having a healthy stockpile of ammo to basically nothing, and I was never able to build it back up. Suddenly, RE4 was survival horror again. I kind of loved it, and definitely loved the game in general, which remains one of my favorites. Plus, protagonist Leon S. Kennedy had a very profound impact on me to the point where my 15-year-old self used the name as a handle on a not unpopular internet forum for which I was member number 8. Despite all that, I haven't kept up with the series. I played some of the demos, and Resident Evil 7 almost got me, but I was honestly too afraid to commit to a full first-person horror experience, especially in the VR mode that I knew I would have made myself play in a vain attempt to justify the purchase of the headset that is collecting dust on my entertainment center. No. It took the return of my boy Leon in the form of last year's Resident Evil 2 Remake to jump back into it. And like everyone else, I had a grand time. I considered reviewing it here, but as I discussed in my recent Q&A, there are conceptual difficulties with the format that I have chosen for my reviews, so I tend not to discuss video games. But clearly I've changed my mind today, because I'm in lockdown, and I played a game that opens with live-action footage of people screaming about a pandemic, and I want to talk about it. So here we are. Hello, and welcome to the Week I Review. You can call me generally competent. And today, I am talking about Resident Evil 3, the 2020 remake of the 1999 game Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. That live-action intro is fascinating because of the reality that Resident Evil 3 has found itself released into. While Naughty Dog has postponed the release of The Last of Us Part 2, something I imagine was both logistical and conceptual, Capcom saw fit to get in on that quarantine content. We see fire trucks and ambulances, riots, and militarized police forces. A CDC official talks about quarantining large sections of the United States, and then series baddie Umbrella Corporation talks about integrity before we watch some folks in scrubs inject something in a big ol' CG arm that we either know is the biological weapon Nemesis, name-checked in the original release's subtitle, or we'll learn very soon. Some of these images are more reminiscent of the news that many of us spend far too much time watching these days than others. But putting things that seem accurate alongside those that don't does make you wonder. as our federal government continues to actively fail its citizens, how bad can this get? Proper riots seem unlikely in the age of social distancing, but my home state of Rhode Island put out a call to the National Guard to check certain coastal towns for wealthy current state New Yorkers who had fled to their second homes and make sure they stay in them. I get it, but that's still pretty fucking unnerving. After the live action stuff, we enter the head of protagonist Jill Valentine, and I mean that literally. The game begins in first person. It's a nightmare, one that ends with her/you looking into the bathroom mirror and turning into a zombie. It is a very cool thing to see happen in first person, particularly the way the screen clouds as her eyes deaden. Jill puts a gun to her head and fires. We wake up, still in first person, until we get back to that mirror where we watch a scene that is almost exactly the one from Gaspar Noé's Enter the Void before it seamlessly moves you to third person. And then, just as you start to wonder what's coming next, Nemesis blows a hole through your wall. The Resident Evil 2 remake has a very deliberate pace. You spend a lot of time in each of the game's handful of connected locations, slowly filling out their maps. There is a lot of backtracking as you realize something you found in one room will finally let you open that door that you've walked by a couple dozen times over the previous few hours. But it's never really frustrating. It's tense, and understanding how it all fits together is exciting. Resident Evil 3 wants you to know right off the bat that it is nothing like its predecessor. This game is less survival horror than spooky action, and I'm not mad about that. But you can see how the difference manifests itself in their approaches to the two games' stalkers, RE2's Mr. X and RE3's Nemesis. Mr. X is scary as hell, showing up every so often to just shake you up a bit. And although he's not terribly difficult to stun and thus avoid, he is invincible, and you can easily find yourself in situations where he can deal some critical damage while you try to get your bearings. And it happens seemingly at random. You'll just be doing your thing when you hear plodding footsteps from a nearby hallway and your hair stands on end because you know shit's about to get real. Nemesis, on the other hand, is the primary antagonist of Resident Evil 3. The big set pieces are almost entirely driven by his appearances, whether escapes or battles. All actual boss fights are against him in his various forms, because each time you defeat him, he comes back bigger and weirder. And you know that when you see Nemesis, the story is about to progress, and you are headed off to a new location. Raccoon City is much larger than the police station and its sewers/laboratories depicted in RE2, and this entry lets you see some of that. You spend a fair amount of time in the streets themselves, and it's nice to have variety in locale. Especially, I enjoyed the early exteriors with their bright storefront signs that just beautifully light up an HDR television. But the larger number of locations that you spend less time in and don't return to make the time you do spend in each less satisfying. You're still backtracking within these smaller areas, but there's none of that satisfaction that comes from RE2's long-term puzzle solving. Instead of being able to open something that blocked you hours before, it's more like a matter of minutes. There is a door that needs a battery to open, and your only goal is to go get the battery to open the door. And once you've got the battery and open the door, you're on to the next thing. And maybe there will be a second layer to it where you need to get two things in sequence, but you still don't feel as if you're putting pieces together. You're just doing what you're told by the conveniently placed note written by a dead person who just so happened to know what predicament you might find yourself in and took the time to even highlight the things that you might need to pick up in that note. Fetch quests are literally always a waste of time, but the way that they present in Resident Evil 2 just feels better because you're constantly expanding on your game world that you want to know everything about. In RE3, each area just means less, no matter how well developed it is, because you know that it's temporary. And this temporariness also impacts the way you approach the zombies themselves. Part of the long game of RE2 is the decisions that you have to make about which zombies you kill and which ones you don't. This was also what made the RE Remake for GameCube amazing. Having camera control and proper aiming is nice, but killing those zombies is hard with an absolute minimum of 3 headshots required to bring one down. And considering how often I would miss my shots, it became pretty darn clear pretty darn quick that I couldn't afford to kill every zombie, even on the standard difficulty. So I started thinking about which ones I needed to take down and which ones I didn't. And it's a choice that matters, because you will pass through the same rooms and hallways many, many times. And you have to think ahead when deciding not to pull a trigger, trying to know who you're willing to face off with again down the line, even if they don't have the Crimson Head ultra strong zombies of the remake. Resident Evil 3 just doesn't require long-term strategy. You're never in one area for longer than an hour, and the entire game is quite short, clocking me in at just over 5. While the length is a pretty widespread complaint for folks, in my case, it was that short in part because of the difficulty level on which I played the majority of the game. I began on standard mode, but about an hour and a half in, I was knocked down, and I phrase it this way because it wasn't really a choice. I had died a few times because that's a thing that happens when you're being surrounded by zombies and also aren't great at video games, and I started getting these pop-ups asking me if I wanted to lower the difficulty. A change that it made sure to point out was irreversible, but somehow didn't fucking ask if I was sure after I accidentally pressed yes instead of no, of course not. Suddenly, I was on assisted mode, and rather unhappy about it. It did occur to me later that I could have reloaded the previous save that was still in standard mode, but by that point I had made enough progress that I didn't want to redo, so I just let it be. The differences are substantial. Enemies go down easier and do less damage, pick up more ammo and have more inventory space to hold that extra ammo. Also get a gosh damn assault rifle. It's honestly too much of a leap between modes. This is something that I was thinking about recently while playing Nier Automata, which is a thing that I've been doing. I went through it once on normal mode, but it was honestly a little too easy. So for the second go around, I thought that I should bring it up to hard. But that jacked up things by like a factor of 5, when really I wanted it to go up by 2 or maybe 3 times. What I really want is just more levels, a sort of hard mode. But at least it lets me change whenever I need to, which is something that every game should do. Oftentimes I will be playing on standard and it will be right for my general competence, until one poorly balanced encounter comes up. I know that I could beat it if I were to grind for a while, but I just don't care enough to do that. So I will drop the difficulty for that one fight and then bring it back up as soon as I'm past it. I understand that in RE3 it would have been slightly complicated to deal with the loss of inventory space and whatever in the reversion to a higher difficulty. But I believe in the designer's ability to figure difficult things out. Like, cut 10% of my ammo and simply discard whatever's in the extra spaces in my hip pouch. I don't care. Just give me the option. Look, I am at least a decade past caring about having a pure kind of experience. I don't care about scores or ranks. I just want to enjoy the game. And being able to shift the difficulty at will as low or high as I like aids greatly in that. In short, Sekiro should have had an easy mode. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. I did want to have some of that fear still, though, so I immediately got rid of the assault rifle and would periodically drop extra found ammo or herbs. As a result, there were moments that were tense because I didn't have enough bullets and had to run around zombies to progress. But even so, I was rarely worried about dying, and the only times I did from that point on were when I went up against enemies with one-hit kill attacks. The general existence of one-shots is something I have a lot of feelings about, most of them negative. But they serve to make RE3 scarier, because the only time I was genuinely in danger was when the possibility for one was on screen. And in that sense, they served a useful purpose for someone who had been basically forced into invincibility. Periodically, the game switches you away from Jill into Carlos Oliveira, an Umbrella Corp lackey who doesn't know that his employer is behind the chaos. His primary weapon is the assault rifle, regardless of difficulty, and so his sections put you up against much larger hordes of zombies and even into one of those fend them all off for an arbitrary amount of time while you wait for a thing to happen scenarios. This is when the gameplay itself becomes much more explicitly action-oriented. And it's odd being in a straight-up action game holding an assault rifle where there's no need to take cover or worry about any kind of ranged attacks. I mean, there are some extra strong zombies that you can be hit by who have these tentacle things from like 15 feet away, but it's not like any of them have guns of their own. Other than Nemesis, who at one point wields a fucking rocket launcher, which is the funny kind of stupid. Jill and Carlos are meant to be the human element of the story. She runs into him and his partner, and he immediately starts both disrespecting and crushing on her because he is male and video games are badly written. His partner realizes who she is and is like, bro, she's strong too. And so Carlos starts calling her super cop because, again, disrespect. But despite that, Jill eventually reciprocates the affection because she is female and video games are badly written. It seems unlikely to have been intentional, but towards the end of the game, my girlfriend who was watching me play quite astutely said, "So this is the story of you as a woman overcoming the doubts of men?" And it's true. Jill is the only female character in the game, and pretty much everyone she runs into condescends her in some way. Either they don't think she's capable of doing a task or needs to be protected or whatever. And so the game is basically just her proving everyone wrong and doing the shit. There are a couple of moments where Carlos comes in to save the day, but it is always as an assist rather than actually stealing the victory. Jill always gets to be the one to deal the final blow. And I just want to say that final blow against Nemesis is fucking wild. Like, the various fights against him in his various forms aren't super interesting, and the last one on easy mode was straight up pathetic, but I will be damned if that carnage wasn't a truly epic way to finish him off. Even if you don't play the game, just watch this shit on YouTube in a video that isn't this one. Like, whoa. A few weeks ago, I talked about the movies Contagion and Outbreak and how they felt in our current moment. While it's clearly the worst movie, Outbreak is the more pleasant watch for the average person right now because it is completely unrealistic and bears effectively no resemblance to current events. Intro aside. Resident Evil 3 has a lot in common with Outbreak. While the film's disease isn't literally man-made the way that Resident Evil's is, it was man's hubris that resulted in all of those deaths in both cases, allowing this virus to spread when the vaccine was available, and one extraordinarily selfish white-haired guy stands in for the evil in both cases. But where Outbreak has an obnoxiously Hollywood ending, RE3 doesn't. And this is the first time in the series a Resident Evil game really could have had one. The larger scale of the game goes right on through to its final goal: get the vaccine that can save the gosh damn world. But this is 2020, and we know that many Residents Evil were and are left to come. They can't well cure the T-virus in the third entry. What about the franchise? So things must go wrong, and the bomb that Dustin Hoffman could stop with a monologue must incinerate Raccoon City. And usually, I would appreciate that. I like stories that have the gumption to actually do the hard thing and burn it all down and make you feel bad, because that's definitely how things would actually play out. There wouldn't be a happy ending. Not for this. But now isn't really the time for that. For once, I kind of wanted a light other than the fire ending 100,000 lives. C'est la vie. 7.3 out of 10. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you particularly to my patrons, my mom, Hamrain Marco, Kat Saracata, Benjamin Schiff, Anthony Cole, @BlasianFMA, Magnolia Denton, and Elliot Fowler. If you like this video, that's great. If not, I'm sorry. If you want to see more, please subscribe. Hope to see you next week.